Matthew Jensen generously sent me his extra copy of the Royal Arsenal Handao for review. Matthew has done a very thorough teardown of the saber as well as its destruction test. I will link his video to the link below. So in this review, I'll be talking about this particular saber. The Royal Arsenal Handao is a replica of the Han Dynasty sabers. So the saber is named the Royal Arsenal because it's based on a particular archaeological excavation in 1983, where they excavated a number of scrolls from the Western Han Dynasty. I believe goes down to the year 35 AD. That particular excavation contains a number of records, and one of these records was a record of numbers of arms that they had, and they recorded that the Handao had about 156,000 Handao in the arsenal, and so this is named after something of that collection, and it should be typical of design of that era. This is made after several archaeological findings and personal private collections where the Handao has existed as largely excavated from the Western Han and also in the Eastern Han Dynasty tend to have very similar shapes. And in some of the tomb murals, we can clearly see people handling this particular saber in a variety of different ways, including with shields, also with the gorang, the hook shield that people of the Han Dynasty used. In some instances too, they also handled it just with the saber itself. Handao itself replaced the double-edged sword that was popular in the previous era near the end of the Western Han period, and also became widely popular later on in the Eastern Han period. The blade construction is force-folded, acid-etched to a very distinct pattern that is quite prominent. The shape of the blade itself is made to be quite accurate to the typical Handao design. So the Handao design itself is not just a straight blade. The backing, so the backing side of the blade itself is slightly concave. It comes down in a sort of a prominent V shape. You can kind of see that particular V shape from the sheath itself. But the V shape itself, the edge of the side of the blade has a slight, inward concave pattern. So there's also some feelings of why is the edge, why is the side edge concave? And one of the things you can think I present is that not only is there to reduce the weight, is also the I-beam shape of it is to increase that structural strength during the swing on impact, right? You can tell also the curvature comes inwards a little bit. And also the blade have a characteristic in Han Dynasty, has a reverse flaring of the tip. So that the blade comes in this way, inward curve, and the very tip of it outwards curved up this way. It's not very obvious, but the design is there. And so that the design itself is there to resist sort of a downward slashing cut this way. You can tell because of how thin it is. It's probably very easy to bend when you smash into something hard enough. And also, you got to think about this would have been within a combat with other shields, right? And the shields themselves, it would be easy to get stuck inside the shield as you cut on the edge of the shield. So this is probably there to reduce a cross-sectional insertion of the blade into the shield, so it's easy to pull out. And then it has that chiseled edge all the way to the tip and comes into an interesting curvature, like a nice curvature this way. So the length of it there's obvious taper in this direction lengthwise. But if you look at the blade width itself, it doesn't obviously narrow until the very end of the point. The blade is very light. It's just about 1 pound. And so because of this, when you hold it, I almost don't feel the blade in my hand. It's extremely light. I can swing it with quite a bit of speed. So the handle is slightly narrow. Also, it's not a straight handle. It comes in a slight edge curvature here with a little bit wider than the top. It comes in with a slight curvature, narrows in the mid, and widens slightly at the very end, with, of course, the characteristic ring palm. Essentially, the tone of it is the exact width of the handle, and the handle underneath has a veneer of wood, kind of a soft wood around it, and then it's wrapped with a silk cord. The guard itself essentially is fastened on top of that particular wooden layer. And to be honest, it's very small. I don't think it's not much more of a function. There's no real guard function to this particular guard other than the fact that it demarcates, where the hand is. And maybe kind of, make you kind of stop the hand from sliding upwards. But other than that, it's very, very tiny. And also I have to say that it's not very tight. So because I can just move it with my hand, with my tip. So I'm pretty sure that it's not very well fastened. And because I can just move with my thumb, if I ever actually use it in a rigorous fight, I think it's very possible that the guard itself will loosen. This, of course, the construction is historic. A lot of archaeological findings have shown that the guard is fastened on top of the wood. And that's the reason why they're always lost in these findings. But I also would like to think that people have tried to go through some effort to make sure at least it's secure enough that it's not going to move from the first time you handle it, right? And so I think a better job could be done to secure the particular guard. So the balancing point of this is, because the waist sheathing is kind of towards 1/3 of the entire length, a little bit forward, but not completely towards the middle like a stick would. So I don't think it's a similar handling, a little bit maybe to a stick, but it's not quite there yet, right? The handling is right here. And I feel that you want to accelerate the edge really, really fast with this blade, and you could do it because it's super light. But because of the fact that it's so thin, I probably don't want to place it super close to me. So maybe what I want to do is that I want to position it way where I can, rotate it either on top of me, I can stab below me. Maybe I want to be able to handling it very much like a stick, a little-ish, not so much like, a close-range rapping saber. That would do its job with the sheer weight of it. So the way to fight with it needs to change a bit. Although I have to say this is a very it is not super fancy. It doesn't have a lot of decorations. You could feel that this is a tool first. It is not so much of a decorative wall hanger. And I actually think it's very functional as a tool itself. I've done I don't have much targets, but I've done some destruct tests and it held up very well. Chopping dried out tree branches, this thing doesn't take a dent at all. So about the quality, the guard and the fitting of the sheath are made of brass. Clearly, there's a gap between the guard and also the sheath fitting themselves. Now, I don't know if this is historic. I believe I've seen a reference to saying that this could be the case, but I can no longer find it online. I looked everywhere, and I just couldn't find a piece of evidence supporting the fact that this design actually is historic. I actually don't think that there is a single example of an asymmetric guard where the guard extends a little bit longer than a handle online. But looking at it though, that was for a much longer saber. And there has been no real examples of how the sheath and this fits together. So I don't think there's any real reason why there's a gap here, other than the fact that maybe the manufacturing process of the sword and the QA is not as good as it could be. Because if I look at some of the pictures on Chen's website, some of the swords that are presented doesn't seem to suggest that this gap should be. So given that there's a gap, I would say that this is a minus in generally for this particular construction. I will hope that this particular thing can be better. Of course, if this is actually within historical designs, I could be wrong. Please send me a reference, right? And the end fittings of the sheath itself and the cap is historic. There's an example they did that really fits into it, which is great. The sheath is lacquered, essentially. The lacquering of the sheath itself, I cannot quite say it obviously, but I can see the wood grain coming out of it. Usually a really strict lacquering job would have required, the base lacquering would have a layer of cloth, and then on top of it you will have several layers of mixed lacquer and dust, not dust, black earth powders that you will mix together over many layers. In this case, I think it's a direct lacquer on wood for this particular sheath. So it's a very basic lacquering job. It's fine probably for what it does. I also, if you look at the fitting on the end cap of the sheath, there are some residual glue there that you can really see. And I think that can be cleaned up, that this kind of work can be a little bit more careful. Just be able to see that glue shows that, it's not great, right? So the characteristic of the blade, it's really light. Did I mention that? Am I going to stop saying that it's super light? It doesn't feel it, and because it has no feeling of the weight, the first thing you time your hand with, the traditional Chinese wrapping of the saber around the neck, on the backing and coming into side, I don't think it's really handled that way at all. Really, because the lightness of it makes me feel it doesn't, like defensively, I don't feel like there's enough mass for me to do this kind of defensive posture, right? If something comes and chops me, I don't have too much confidence that this thing will actually block that incoming attack. It's really thin. It handles almost, so this is my suspicion, and people, I might be wrong on it, but my instinct when handling it is that you have to remember this is lighter than the Chujian that I have previously reviewed. It's lighter even than that. And that was about 1.3 pounds, I believe. So it's lighter than the Chujian itself. So as a hacking weapon, as a cutting weapon, it doesn't have enough heft to it for me to feel that people cut with it fine, but because there's a lack of heft and also the lack of weight of it, makes me feel that defensively and offensively, handling of the blade would be more similar to a sword, to a double-edged sword. And even the Chujian itself is much more of a hacking weapon in terms of the balance and overall sturdiness than this one. So the first time I handle it, my immediate instinct is actually to stab with it, right? Because, obviously this have a very small guard here. But if you take a look at the handle here, that if I were to stab this weapon in a tilted upwards manner in this direction, I don't actually need that guard because the friction and angle of my hand on top of the blade will stop it solid. So I almost feel like this feels a little more like a very long dagger-ish kind of feeling to it, a very long, sharp, pointy knife that, because the weight is actually, some heavy knives are actually, heavier than this. So I feel that this weapon is probably best used paired with a shield. And I feel that the best way to use it is actually to have a upward stabbing stroke as you use a dagger, and pair that with a downward cutting stroke. And I think this is the best way to use this kind of weapon. For my instinctively, that is how I would use it. So if I have a shield with me, that's the first thing I would do. I would have hidden behind the shield, and I would defend it with a shield and use this as a force stab. And if you think about it, it's not so much that's such a movement tactic, especially with something of this length. You have to get quite close to someone, right? Because the length of the saber makes me feel that I have to get pretty close to my opponent. And it's not like the longer swords themselves where I can keep myself at a distance. This, I gotta get in there. And then I have to stab with it. And I really feel like, it is a soldier's weapon. And I need to charge into the formation. I need to charge into spear formations. And I have to do my thing there. I've cut with it. It cuts fine. I made a poor man's version of the Tameshigiri mat roll. I essentially rolled up. I soaked the cardboard and rolled it up into a big roll. It's harder to cut than it looks. And I think it made a fairly big dent, although I wasn't able to cut completely through it. It's also because I really need to improve my cutting stand. I don't think my targets are sitting there very well. That's sort of a project. It's just really hard to get proper targets and gain the proper materials during the COVID times. Everything is to be closed, and so I've been having trouble gaining a lot of cutting targets right now. And also I'm not getting as much sparring as I could be, and I really want to make some sparring videos, but COVID, right? I can't really meet anyone, I can't really film anything. So these are the limits. I just unfortunately have to work with. So I really want to test this weapon with a shield, and I really want to test something of similar weight and see what kind of technique people use. And I think that's really what needs to happen with this weapon. I don't feel like any current Chinese saber techniques can be translated to this weapon. I feel like it is a completely category of its own, and we need to figure that out. My instinct has been that there's a lot of talk about why did this weapon, the Handao, replace the sword, double-edged swords. And I think by handling it, I kind of get some inklings. I can kind of see why this replaced the sword, because one, it is just as strong as a sword. Two, the weight of it is similar. The way you want to use it is similar. It seems like a generalist weapon. It's good at slashes, and it's also good at stabs, right? It does both. And also, because of the single edge, the ability to strengthen it, it can enhance a little bit more. And also that it's just cheaper to produce. Imagine you have to, because once you want to create two edges, then you immediately must make the middle spine thicker in order to be more strengthened. And that creates a lot more craftsmanship, and that's more expensive to do. The advantage of having double blade, though, is that once you've cut on one side and the edge goes down, you can cut with the other side, right? In this case, you don't have a backup edge. But given it's cheaper to produce, you can mass manufacture better, almost the same quality, and the training is easier too. There's less chance of this coming back and cut yourself, right? So I'm able to be more forgiving in my techniques. So I can see why this became a replacement during that era. Is it true that these two weapons are super different in sort of sword is stabbing, this is chopping? I don't think it is such a clear and cut case. I think that characteristic become more divergent in later eras, where after the post-Tang world, sabers became a purely cutting weapon and started to be optimized just for that, and swords became much more of a thrust weapon and optimized just for that. But during the Han period, I think between the Western and Eastern Han split, swords and also because of the better improvement in the use of steel, the differences between swords and sabers are not yet so clear. I mean, they're starting to be different, and yet they're not at a certain point where they're super clear in terms of usages. So I think there's some interesting stuff. Ultimately, we have to try it out, get some shields, get some sparring grade stuff, and try it out. So overall, this is a very interesting weapon. It is a very basic design, no frills, Han Dynasty replica of the saber. I would classify this weapon as a unique replica. The value of it is primarily in the blade, the craft of the blade, and especially the blade curvature itself. It is a functional, light piece of weapon that I enjoy handling, to be honest. And I think it is quite practical in terms of having it in your home arsenal. I'm not sure, I don't want to coin the term you use for home defense, but when trouble comes in my home, I might grab this just because of how easy to wield it is. I hope you enjoyed this review, and thanks for watching.